Home is a safe haven and a comfortable environment, a home to live in with our families and pets, as well as the opportunity to spend time with friends. A house may be used to make both personal and economic memories. It is possible to be ourselves at home, but how far would you go to keep your house safe from Mother Nature? While some people decide to cut their losses when it comes to floods, fires, or tornadoes, others take extreme measures to preserve what is theirs. In this video, we are going on a journey deep into the earth to look some of the crazy people who did everything to save their homes. But before we start, please subscribe to Unimaginable and hit the bell icon for more updates. Security, authority, belonging, identity, and seclusion are just a few of the benefits we receive from home. For some of us, no matter how big or little our homes are, they are our shelters and sanctuaries. Here are some examples of crazy people. How did they save their homes? Number 6. The concrete safe room. What is the most essential feature when purchasing a new house? Is it the number of bedrooms, a location, or size? While the Phillips family from Mississippi joked that a safe room was what sold them on their new home in March 2020, most people laughed. It provided them with some much-needed seclusion, while still allowing them to double up as a closet for their family of 4. Their new home was in the heart of Tornado Alley of America, so they were understandably apprehensive. Their location in the United States made them particularly vulnerable to tornadoes. The state of Mississippi had seen EF4 and EF5 tornadoes that can hit speeds approaching 200 miles per hour simply by wind alone before, so the Phillips were unwilling to take chances. While others viewed their priorities to be somewhat backwards, they would eventually see how well-founded their choice truly was. Because just a few weeks later, a devastating sequence of storms ravaged the South, damaging hundreds of homes and leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Around 80 tornadoes destroyed homes and left a path of devastation across the states in only a few weeks. The parents grabbed their 2 young children and fled into the safe room with only seconds to spare as the terrifying tornadoes began to batter their house. Their home was reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes, leaving just the safe room behind. The family emerged unscathed after the storm had passed, but their house appeared to have been torn up from the foundations. Andrew Phillips claims that it was Jesus who defended them during the storm. Maybe so, although the concrete closet played an important part in their miraculous salvation as well. Number 5. The fire shields. Every year, it appears like California is hit by a new wave of unending infernos that scorch the terrain. You might be wondering why anybody would want to live in a state where you could expect $85 billion in damage in 2017 and $400 billion in 2018. What structures could possibly survive such widespread fire damage? In 2014, Sierra Nevada Fire Service made a last-ditch effort to save 5 historic cabins by making them look like baked potatoes. U.S. Forest Service archaeologists, in a last-ditch effort to protect them from the flames of French fire, placed enormous fire-resistant wraps from Firazat on the structures. However, officials quickly discovered that they appeared like big rolls of tin foil when they arrived, despite the fact that it seemed pointless following a fire that had destroyed 13,700 acres of forest with ease. They covered the cabin's roofs to basement in gleaming sheets. They were not fireproof, but they would supposedly prevent embers and radiant heat from damaging the cabins. Despite looking like bright beacons of obstinacy, the smoke eventually dissipated to reveal that the cabins had survived. Their story encouraged other fire management companies to utilize Firazat shields on their own historical buildings. In 2017, Crater Lake firefighters used Firazat shields, as did Yosemite Services in 2018. Their reach, however, did not stop at the borders of the forest. Homeowners in more rural, seasonal fire danger areas like Florida, Arizona, and California have started purchasing fire shields as well. Fire shields are more expensive than aggravating your neighbors. A single 50-pound roll costs, which can cover about 1,200 square feet, costs a huge around $900. However, considering how much it would save you over time, cost is no object when it comes to saving cash. Number 4. The Eye of the Storm Mansion. There is an odd house on one row of beautiful mansions along the South Carolina coast that stands out like a sore thumb. The Eye of the Storm is a deviant-looking dome, with neighbors pointing and giggling at it, but they will rue their decision come hurricane season. This stretch of the United States southern seaboard is particularly vulnerable to storms. The parents of designer George Paul lost their beloved summer home to Hugo in 1989 on this very site, back then known as Klingman's Dome. It had whipped up winds of 120 miles per hour and destroyed their beachfront home to pieces. George vowed that they would never have to go through something so devastating again, and he set about creating a hurricane-proof house that his parents could be proud of. The technique called for inflating an airform, which was inflated to a height of 37 feet. Steel was then sprayed inside and around the interior, replacing it with a perfectly sturdy dome. Because the roof and walls are all one solid piece, a hurricane winds cannot rip anything away from it during a storm. It also has 8 wide openings at its base level, allowing storm winds and water to rush through without damaging the top levels. Some people may have been quick to judge the strangely bulbous form, but the design of George has so far withstood every hurricane that has been thrown at it, including Hurricane Florence of this year, whose 100 miles per hour winds and merciless sea levels damaged approximately 51,000 homes and caused approximately $5 billion in damage. Number 3. The Lift House. When a new housing development began digging foundations along the riverbanks of Dhaka, notoriously flooding capital city of Bangladesh in 2010, people scoffed at the architect. After all, why would you build on land that was expected to flood nearly every year? At first, it appeared to be a tremendous waste of bricks and mortar, but what they did not realize is that this home was being built with floods in mind and would soon revolutionize architecture forever. This prototype home, dubbed the Lift House, incorporated 2 odd-looking bamboo structures into its design. They were placed in a hollow ferro cement foundation and filled with over 8,000 used and empty plastic bottles from each bamboo frame. These completed components were experimentally secured to the red brick core of the building after they were built. But instead of rushing to install flood defenses, its builders sat back and simply waited for the rivers to overflow their banks. When the water level is extremely high, these structural foundations resemble lightweight concrete boats due to their watertight design. The 8 buoyant bamboo frames rise over the rising waters while still linked to the crimson brick spine. This means that up to a height of 12 feet, the families residing in them are kept safe from floating away down the river. When the floods subside, the buildings then settle back onto wet soil. Lift in the Lift House represents low-income flood-proof technology. As a result, this million-dollar concept does not have to be expensive to construct because it uses inexpensive materials and a straightforward design. As a result, it has the ability to benefit the poorest sections of society who are most affected by flooding. Finally, there is a design that can assist keep the majority of people afloat. Number 2. Victorious Vicksburg. What extreme measures would you take to safeguard your property from a flood? Residents of Vicksburg, Mississippi demonstrated how much they valued their homes in 2011 by undertaking huge development projects to safeguard them. These homes were located along the Yazoo River, a minor tributary of the mighty Mississippi that is better known for flooding than for mud pie. Floods and heavy rains hundreds of kilometers upstream gave a foreboding indication that this river might soon break its banks. Typically, these rivers' major levees would be enough to keep back the rising tides. However, worrisome reports began to trickle in, claiming that the rising water was capable of breaching their limits with ease. Residents on low-lying deltas of agricultural land who lived near the advancing river decided not to take any chances and began constructing massive individual levees. Residents of Vicksburg, Mississippi built dikes out of earth and sand to keep the water out of their homes, cutting themselves off from roads if they had to. Other residents mocked their cautious neighbors, secure in the knowledge that the majority of Vicksburg was in a 100-year flood zone. That meant there was just a 1% chance of the area being flooded each year. Many people were certain that they would never need flood insurance because they thought they were safe from the danger associated with wetness. Those who lived and worked on the Delta, on the other hand, were not deterred by any amount of derision. Then, in a situation that no one had predicted, both the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers burst their banks with record-breaking heights. The Mississippi at Vicksburg was 57.1 feet high, forcing the Yazoo to rise above its banks where the two waterways met. Towns and farms upstream of the area rapidly started to fill as a result of this event. The sudden arrival of such a huge quantity of water flooding at the same time was like being launched from an ark into great seas. And when the rushing water surged beneath low-lying areas, murky water covered them. While some people panicked and fled, homeowners on Delta Islands were sitting pretty. Many of the structures had emerged from the floods virtually unharmed, forming islands in the stream. Most of them were bone dry, but some unfortunate others had neglected to factor in how deep the waters would rise. The majority of them underestimated how sturdy their barriers needed to be. Nonetheless, the vast majority of them were able to keep their heads high, despite some judgy people. Number 1. The Watertight Tubes. People in Brazoria County, Texas began hoarding sandbags and dusting off their rubber boots as record-breaking storms swept over the state in May 2016. According to weather forecasts, Texas was experiencing a week-long storm of thunderstorms and heavy rain that was among the worst the state had ever seen. But what was far more frightening was that the storms were heading their way. In less than 24 hours, over 19 inches of rain had fallen in Brenham County, Texas, just 90 miles away. As a result of the increasing rainfall, overflowing rivers and lakes submerging whole neighborhoods, while flooding roads and bridges with deadly consequences emerged on the news. Randy Wagner was the only one who was not ready for the worst. Residents of Brazoria, unwilling to leave, gathered what they could and reluctantly departed, save for Randy Wagner. He worried about his family and property and decided that he would do everything in his power to prevent his home from being flooded. In an attempt to preserve everything he loved, Randy conducted an internet search for any type of miracle solution and came upon a website called Aqua Dam. They sold huge, watertight tubes that could be filled with water to create a temporary barrier. The height and weight of these glorified water balloons was enough to construct a highly effective barrier against incoming floods. They rid you of the problem of time-consuming, dirt-filled alternatives like sandbags. To Randy, the entire thing sounded too good to be true. He had never heard of anyone else employing one of these things before, but he decided on the ultimate gamble by purchasing a 30-inch tall, 450 feet Aqua Dam for $8,000. He then made the dangerous 520-mile round trip from his home in North Carolina to pick up an almost 800-pound box. He had hoped to return home before the storms began pounding down on his house. He now found himself worrying instead about whether or not he would survive. Just 3 days later, water began to inundate his land around his property. Without wasting a beat, Randy and 2 others got to work inflating the considerable amount of tubing around his family home, which they had previously molded using 2 gasoline pumps and water from a nearby ditch. In just a few hours, the protective project was ready to be put to the ultimate test, but not without attracting attention from some nosy people. When strangers saw Randy working on the creative device in his yard, they laughed at him and dubbed him insane. They all clearly thought that there was no way such a ridiculously simple idea would succeed against this record-breaking downpour. Despite the laughter of those bystanders, Randy refused to give up hope, and he and his family waited for the storm to pass as best they could. In June, the Brazos River in Brazoria County began its relentless rise out of its banks and inundated adjacent inhabited regions. The floods got so severe that a presidential disaster declaration was called for, and thousands of people were forced to evacuate their houses, leaving all they owned behind. But the residents of one family stood proud and dry as news helicopters broadcast images of damaged homes and waterlogged residences. Like a tiny green island floating in the muck of pandemonium, the crazy scheme of Randy Wagner to preserve his house had succeeded. The water levels rose to a dangerous 27 inches, but they were just not high enough to breach the 30-inch dam. He estimates that this $8,300 inflatable investments saved him at least $150,000 in repairs and did not even need him to activate his flood insurance. The floods damaged more than 1,500 homes, causing loss of $3.8 million. Well, that is the end of the video. Do you have any stories of crazy people like them? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks for watching the video. See you next time.